Virus, just hours after returning from a Trump rally in Minnesota on Air Force One with President Trump. She'd also flown with the president to Cleveland, Ohio for the debate on Tuesday night, US time. First, the president tweeted that he and First Lady Melania Trump were in quarantine. But then, within hours, came the confirmation. They had tested positive. The tweet said, "Tonight, FLOTUS, First Lady Melania Trump, and I tested positive for COVID-19. We will begin our quarantine and recovery process immediately. We will get through this together," the president said. Now, as we speak, most Americans are waking up to this news just 31 days from their presidential election, with millions of early votes already being cast. The President of the United States has a potentially fatal disease. We don't yet know how far the infection has reached either. Other senior staff are being tested. Vice President Mike Pence is also believed to have been in contact with both Hope Hicks and President Trump in recent days. And of course, if President Trump was already carrying the virus during the debate on Tuesday night, where he was socially distant but still in proximity of former Vice President Joe Biden, when he was still downplaying the need to wear face masks at all and mocking Biden for doing so.
You have to understand, if you look, I mean, I have a mask right here. I put a mask on, when I think I need it. Tonight, as an example, everybody's had a test and you've had social distancing and all of the things that you have to, but I wear masks when needed. When needed, I wear masks.
Okay, let me ask.
I don't wear masks like him. Every time you see him, he's got a mask. He could be speaking 200 feet away from it. He shows up with the biggest mask I've ever seen.
And that, for me, was the funniest moment of the debate. Doesn't seem
so funny now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's
and
funny how
that is, I guess, in a political sense, if we put aside for just one moment the health concerns about President Trump and other White House staff and First Lady Melania Trump, but that President Trump put a flag in the ground quite early this year as being the guy who was against masks, even though he was early on getting advice to that effect, particularly when they were concerned about preserving PPE for first responders and hospital staff and so on. But that President Trump has been seen to be downplaying the infectiousness of this disease and the deadliness of this disease. This is potentially very politically damaging for him, I would say.
Potentially, but we'll talk about that more later. Let's talk about the person first, Donald Trump, who is sick. Okay, the first thing everyone does in this scenario is they go straight to the stats. They try to look for what's the percentage chance of something bad happening. I'll tell you the numbers as they exist. The CDC numbers as of August 22, the case fatality rate, obviously the worst case scenario, that's deaths divided by confirmed cases in America for patients over 65 is nearly 16%. Now that is 65 all the way up into the 80s, all right, which is older than Trump. So the number's probably a little less for someone Trump's age. Those numbers are very different in different countries, different scenarios, but they're the CDC numbers. Trump's obviously older than 65. He's a man, the rates are higher for a man. He's also obese. And analysis from obesity reviews finds that people with obesity who contract COVID are 113% more likely than people of healthy weight to land in hospital, and 48% more likely to die. Now that's obviously...
Which is one of the reasons why people now believe the United States has suffered a significantly higher mortality rate than a number of nations because, as we've known for decades, America is a fat country.
Yeah. Now I emphasise, those numbers are from the beginning, right? A lot of people died early on because they didn't know what they were doing, nursing home disasters, all the rest of it, okay? So that's not predictive in any way, shape or form. And I am not a doctor. So we probably should talk to one.
Yes, let's get an expert opinion on that from one of Australia's and indeed the world's leading infectious diseases experts, Professor Peter Collignon. Peter, welcome to the program. Donald Trump, on the barest of known health statistics, he's 74 years old. He is technically obese at over 110 kilograms, a BMI of over 30. He doesn't drink or smoke, and he is apparently not diabetic or pre-diabetic. Based on those bare numbers, can you guess at how at risk he might be of serious complications from COVID-19?
Well, the exact number in an individual is difficult, but he's obviously more at risk because he's older. If you're between the age of 45 and 55, your chance of dying from COVID is about 0.2%. But once you get to 65 to 75, it goes up to 2%. And the higher you are in that, or the older you are in that age group, the higher the risk. And obviously, if you're overweight, that's an extra risk on top of that as well. Now, the trouble is, it also depends on how you go, because he, at the moment, I understand, is asymptomatic and was found because he had a swab, I presume, because one of his close contacts actually had COVID. So if he stays asymptomatic, well, that's actually good. But if we remember what happened with Boris Johnson, he had COVID and didn't look too bad for about a week or so, and then deteriorated and needed to go to hospital and, in fact, to ICU. So that's still a possibility. But in an individual, you can just say, look, these are what the chances are. And the overall chances is he'll recover from this and won't die, given the overall numbers. But he has still got a reasonable chance of, first of all, getting very sick and maybe needing hospital care, but also even, mortality is a significant risk at probably a few percent at his age and by being overweight.
Doctor, if Trump experiences symptoms, how long could he expect to experience those symptoms for?
Well, again, that's variable. I mean, what happens is people start off being asymptomatic. They have virus usually a day or two before they get symptoms. And the symptoms in a lot of people can be very mild, and then they get over it. They're just infectious to others. But if it progresses, what you would expect is multiplication in your nose, the back of your throat, your upper airways, and you'll probably develop a cough. You might get slightly short of breath, although that's more an indication that it's gone further and it's gone into your lungs. And obviously, if it gets into your lungs, that's a problem, because that's the people who get severe COVID. And in some people, you can also get heart complications. Now, the only good news, if you look at this, is if you look at nursing home studies more recently done, and also cruise ships where a lot of people are in their 70s and 80s, about half the people that are found remain asymptomatic, interestingly. So obviously, if you're in that group, it's not good for others because you can transmit it to others. But for you as an individual, it's pretty good, although a lot of people with COVID will end up with symptoms for many weeks and sometimes months afterwards, where they have fatigue and tiredness.
Peter, we do know, based on the President's public itinerary in the last 3 days, he has been on Air Force One a number of times to the debate in Cleveland, Ohio. He stood for 90 minutes next to former Vice President Joe Biden. He went to a rally in Minnesota, attended by thousands of people. Who is at most risk of catching this from the President? People on Air Force One, Joe Biden, who was 5 metres away from him for an hour and a half, people at that rally. Who would you be most concerned about?
Well, you can't. Well, the people you're most concerned about are those who are close indoors for a prolonged period of time. And that's why household contacts have got a much higher risk. Household contacts, to put it into context, if you're in the same house as somebody, even sleeping in the same bed, if your spouses, etc., there's probably between a 10 and 20% chance you're going to get it. And obviously, the lower your contact, the lower the time, and the further you're away, the lower that probability. But there's rules in Australia where we look at what we call a close contact, and they need to isolate and get tested. And that's often if people, for instance, are close to somebody for 15 minutes within 1.5 meters with no contact in particular, they're at high risk. So I presume the American public health people will look at that, and anybody who's been within a close contact, not wearing a mask in particular for any prolonged period of time, particularly if it's indoors, they're the ones that most have to worry. The people that are within 2 meters, 1.5 meters of Mr. Trump for particularly more than 10 or 15 minutes.
And Doctor, the medicines and treatments that we're now using, like medicines like, say, remdesivir, dexamethasone, are they more effective when you treat someone early, before they have symptoms, or does it make no difference?
Well, it probably won't necessarily make a lot of difference. The only therapy that might actually improve you if you get it early is what we call plasma or antibodies from people who have recovered, or they've even got monoclonal ones now. The steroids, the dexamethasone, that does decrease mortality, but only in people who are very sick or on a ventilator. So getting that early probably doesn't do any good. In fact, it might do you harm. And all the other antiviral drugs, they have some benefit, but it's not flash. Even remdesivir, for instance, instead of being in hospital for 15 days, you're in hospital for 11 days. It doesn't obviously decrease mortality. So the main therapy is supportive, making sure people get enough oxygen if they need it, making sure if they need to go on a ventilator, they get it, making sure they have enough fluids, and particularly clots and, clotting in your veins and getting clots going to your lung is more common if you've got COVID. So there are precautions you can take with other drugs to decrease your chance of taking that. So people are looked after much better now than 4 or 5 months ago. There's a lower mortality, probably because it's associated with better medical care and knowing more of the complications and being able to address those early than what this was the situation, say, in March and April.
A final question for you, Peter Collignon. What is the best case scenario for President Trump? The CDC guidelines say that if you go into quarantine, you need to be there for 14 days. That puts the second presidential debate very much in doubt. What would be the soonest that President Trump could emerge from quarantine, assuming all is well?
Well, I think the earliest would be probably 14 days, because I think you've got to assume that people are infectious for at least 7 to 10 days after they come down with infection. And if he's asymptomatic at the moment, that may not be for another couple of days before he develops symptoms. So if you get mild illness or you're asymptomatic, you can presumably work from your office and, do Zoom conferences or even debates. But I would think he needs to avoid anyone for probably the next 14 days at least. Until, first of all, he's in a good frame of mind and good health to be able to make decisions and speaks, appropriately. And secondly, that he's not a risk to others, which will be, I think, at least 10 or 14 days from now.
Professor, thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Now, Chaz, one of the questions that's been asked of me the most in the last few hours on social media and elsewhere is, well, what happens if President Trump, 1, dies, or 2, becomes so ill that he can't be president? What happens there? That all comes down to the 25th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Section 1 is the most severe one. That's regarding death. It says that in case of the removal of the president from office or of his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president. So Mike Pence becomes president any time between now and midday on the 20th of January, no matter what the election outcome is. The election will happen on the 3rd of November. Even though President Trump is on the ballot, Mike Pence would still succeed to the office prior to January the 20th, and then whoever wins the Electoral College will become president. Maybe Mike Pence, maybe Joe Biden at that stage. Section 3 talks about what happens in illness or incapacity, and that's usually invoked. Section 3, it's only been invoked a few times when
Ronald Reagan
had a colonoscopy.
Yep.
George W. Bush had a couple of colonoscopies as well. That's when they know they're going in for a procedure with a general anaesthetic. They sign a letter over to the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate, Chuck Grassley, saying basically, I'm going under. The Vice President is president until I send you another letter saying, hey, I'm back. Which, of course, means that if there are complications and they are incapacitated, in a coma, die from surgery, etc., again, the Vice President is in control. Then, of course, there's the possibility of Donald Trump holds on to office, doesn't sign a letter, but under Section 4, if he is perhaps comatose, then it takes the Vice President and at least half the members of Cabinet to say, well, the President can't be President. He can't make decisions like whether to, press the big red button on the desk. So at that point, you need half the Cabinet to write to the Congress and say the President should be removed from office. Vice President Mike Pence becomes acting President of the United States. That is also the section that some people were kind of hoping would be invoked when they said Trump's crazy, he should be removed from office. So those are the options that are open right there. But it does throw this huge question mark, and also a huge question mark over next week's vice presidential debate with Mike Pence and Kamala Harris, because we could be in a situation next week where Mike Pence becomes acting President of the United States, and a question as to whether that debate should proceed or whether we are effectively seeing a new presidential debate. And then questions about, would Mike Pence then go and conduct the next 2 presidential debates against Joe Biden? All sorts of possibilities, and we are in literally uncharted waters there.
We absolutely are. And I should say that if the worst happened before the election and he died, then Mike Pence would be president, but not necessarily the Republican nominee for president. They would have to choose him, and they would choose Mike Pence, obviously, at this late date, but they don't have to.
Yes, it's not a constitutional requirement, in the same way as if Vice President Biden had been exposed to the coronavirus either by President Trump or his staff or by somebody else. But if Joe Biden would also become ill, which is not impossible, and again, a man in his late 70s in Biden's case could also run the risk of serious complications, if he was unable to stand at the election, then the Democratic Party would have to go through a nomination process, which they do very quickly and on the internet, and Kamala Harris would presumably become the nominee, but that's not automatic. There's no constitutional assumption of that power.
The question is, though, the more likely scenarios where he's either remains asymptomatic or becomes mildly symptomatic.
Yep.
How does campaigning work?
Right.
I imagine, like for a start, he can't campaign for 2 weeks,
Yep.
regardless. I imagine Joe Biden.
Well, he can't go to rallies,
Yeah.
but he can do the Joe Biden's basement campaign.
He can. I imagine whatever he does, Joe Biden will happily match him.
Yeah.
I don't think Joe Biden's going to complain about that. But if it becomes seriously symptomatic, if he's sick, if he's not dead, but he's sick and he's in hospital, what, do we just call off the election campaign for the next 5 weeks and then there's an election without a campaign?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as we'll see a little later in the program, President Trump is behind in his re-election, badly behind, just over a month out from the election. And he put in a pretty shocking debate performance this week as well. Well, it's going to be interesting to find out whether he was experiencing any symptoms earlier in the week, whether that affected his performance at all. There are some people saying that he was hot, he was sweating, he was carrying on, etc. We just don't know. As for the impact that this could have, I mean, to an extent, that is very much determined on whether the president sails through this as on a human level. We would hope that he is fine.
And his doctor says at the moment he is well, whatever that means.
Yeah,
well.
yeah. And the guy, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he has no history of respiratory problems, which is one of the big risk factors as well. But he is a big guy. So if Trump is largely asymptomatic, if he gets a light dose of this and he's back out on the campaign trail in a couple of weeks, is there any way he can turn this to his advantage and say, see, it wasn't that bad after all, I don't know what all the fuss about? Or does the fact that there are already 205,000 dead Americans mean he can't possibly say that? He has to be gracious. He has to say, I'm lucky I got the best